The water was on fire, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The surface of the Yangtze River, that vast brown artery cutting through the heart of China, was actually burning. Fuel oil from the shattered hull of HMS Amethyst had spread across the current and caught a spark from somewhere in the chaos. A burning shell casing, a ruptured fuel line. Nobody would ever know. And the river itself became a furnace. Black smoke rolled in thick columns toward a sky that should have been blue on that April morning, but was instead choked to a sickly orange haze. The screaming of men in the water mixed with the rhythmic thunder of Chinese communist artillery on both banks, and on the deck of a listing British naval frigate, amid the wreckage of shattered steel and splintered wood, and the scattered debris of an ambush that had come without warning. A small black and white cat was burning alive. He was not moving. He was curled against a bulkhead near what had been the captain's cabin, and his fur, that distinctive tuxedo pattern of white chest and black back that had made him the beloved mascot of every man aboard, was singed down to the skin along his left flank. His ears were flat against his skull. His eyes were closed. The medics who found him in those first terrible minutes after the shelling began assumed he was dead. One of them nudged him with his boot, gently, a reflex of compassion in the middle of madness. And the cat did not respond. They had to move on. There were 31 dead men who needed attention. There were 23 wounded who would die without immediate intervention. There were fires to fight, and a ship to keep from sinking, and an enemy who showed no signs of stopping. There was no time to mourn a cat. So they left him there, in the wreckage, in the smoke, curled against a wall that had once been the private sanctuary of a commander who was himself now among the dead. And they went on doing what sailors do when the world collapses around them. They kept fighting. They kept the ship alive. They did not surrender. And hours later, when the guns finally fell silent for a brief moment, and a young rating named Ian Stewart went back to that bulkhead for reasons he would never fully explain — instinct, guilt, grief, simple human tenderness — he found the cat breathing. Barely, but breathing. He picked him up and carried him to the sick bay, and what happened next, over the following 101 days, would become one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the Royal Navy. It would become a story about survival, about loyalty, about what it means to fight not for a country or a cause or an ideology, but for the person standing next to you. About how sometimes the most powerful weapon a navy possesses is not the caliber of its guns, but the fragile, stubborn, incomprehensible will of something small and wounded to simply keep going. This is the story of Able Seaman Simon, and it is a story that deserves to be told in full. To understand how a stray cat ended up in the middle of one of the most dangerous naval incidents of the Cold War, you have to go back to the docks of Hong Kong in the early weeks of 1948. The HMS Amethyst was a Black Swan-class sloop, a sleek, purpose-built warship of 1,350 tons, designed for anti-submarine warfare and escort duties, the kind of vessel that kept the arteries of the British Empire open in the post-war years when the empire was visibly contracting, but not yet willing to admit it. She had a crew of approximately 183 men. She carried a complement of weapons that ranged from twin 4-inch guns to Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons. And she was, by any objective measure, a serious instrument of naval power. She was also, by the traditions of the Royal Navy that stretched back centuries, a ship that needed a cat. Not as a mascot in the sentimental tourist brochure sense of the word, as a practical necessity. Ships in the mid-20th century still carried enormous quantities of food stores, sacks of flour, crates of dried goods, enormous supplies of rice. And wherever there are food stores, there are rats. Wherever there are rats on a warship, there is the very real risk of contaminated food, chewed through wiring, and the slow biological attrition of a crew weakened by disease before any enemy fires a single shot. The Royal Navy had understood this for so long that it had become institutional wisdom embedded in regulation and tradition. You kept a cat, you kept your ship healthy, and you kept your crew sharp. What was not in any regulation, and what nobody had anticipated, was finding the particular cat that would become Simon. He was discovered hiding in a coil of rope on the dockside at Hong Kong by a 17-year-old sailor named George Hickenbottom. The exact date is not recorded with precision, but it was sometime in March 1948, in the humid, raucous, extraordinarily alive atmosphere of the Hong Kong waterfront, where the smell of cooking food and diesel fuel and salt water mixed into something that was distinctly itself and unlike anywhere else on Earth. Hickenbottom was young, far from home, the way boys always are when they join a navy. And the cat was young too, visibly underfed, ribs showing through that tuxedo coat, eyes enormous in a face that was still more kitten than adult. The boy picked up the cat and smuggled him aboard the Amethyst inside his uniform jacket. This was technically against regulations. Naval authorities had to formally approve the presence of any ship's cat. There were procedures, there were forms. There was a hierarchy that governed even this. Hickenbottom, being 17 and acting on pure instinct, ignored all of it. He hid the cat in the engine room for a week, feeding him scraps from his own rations, before the inevitable happened and an officer found them out. The officer in question looked at the thin, large-eyed cat with the white chest and the absurdly dignified expression, and apparently made a rapid calculation about whether any good whatsoever would come from pursuing the matter through official channels. He did not pursue it. The cat was given a name, Simon, and the ship's company adopted him with the casual, unsentimental affection that sailors tend to reserve for the things they love most. He ate from the officer's mess. He slept wherever he pleased, which was usually in someone's bunk, and usually with a preference for the warmest and most comfortable berth available. He hunted rats with a methodical efficiency that impressed even the most pragmatic members of the crew. He knocked papers off desks and walked across navigation charts, and generally conducted himself with the sovereign confidence of an animal that has understood, at the most fundamental level, that everyone around him secretly wants him to stay. The ship's complement changed over those months, the way crews always do on active navals. Vessels, men rotating out, men rotating in, the endless flux of a military organization that never fully stops moving. But Simon remained. He was the constant. He was the continuity. When HMS Amethyst completed a refit and departed for the China station in late 1948, Simon was aboard, officially listed now on the ship's complement, rated as a supernumerary, which was the Royal Navy's rather elegant bureaucratic solution to the problem of an animal who performed genuine operational functions but could not technically hold a rank. He had his own service record. He had his own rations allowance. He had, in the informal economy of shipboard life, something more valuable than either. He had the affection and the trust of the men who served alongside him. And in the spring of 1949, all of that, the comfort, the warmth, the easy affection of a ship at routine operations, was about to be shattered in a way that none of them, not the officers, not the ratings, not the cat sleeping in the captain's cabin on the morning of April 20th, could have possibly foreseen. The situation in China in April 1949 was, to put it simply, one of the most consequential political upheavals of the 20th century, approaching its final, irreversible conclusion. The Chinese Civil War, which had been grinding on with various interruptions and transformations since 1927, was entering its terminal phase. Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army had driven the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek to the southern bank of the Yangtze River, and what remained to be decided was whether the nationalists could hold that line, or whether the PLA would cross and complete the conquest of mainland China. The Western powers, Britain, the United States, France, watched this with considerable anxiety, but with a certain pragmatic recognition that there was very little they could do about it. Britain's specific concern was not ideological but practical. It had significant commercial interests in China, a large community of British nationals in Shanghai and other coastal cities, and a traditional presence on Chinese waters that it was reluctant to surrender even as the political ground shifted beneath it. HMS Amethyst had been ordered to sail up the Yangtze from Shanghai to relieve HMS Consort at Nanking, providing a visible British naval presence and, if necessary, evacuation capacity for British nationals in the capital, which was clearly about to fall to the communists. It was, in the language of diplomats and naval planners, a routine operation. It was also, given the extraordinary tension of the moment, PLA forces massing on the northern bank, nationalist forces in chaos on the southern bank, and the mutual suspicion between the British naval presence and the new Chinese communist power at an absolute peak, an operation that carried risks that the planners had either underestimated or chosen not to articulate too loudly. When HMS Amethyst entered the Yangtze on the morning of April 20th, 1949, she was flying a large white ensign, the unmistakable flag of the Royal Navy, and proceeding at normal speed in waters that had seen British warships for more than a century. There was no reason, by any conventional reading of international maritime law and diplomatic protocol, for anyone to fire on her. And then someone did. The first shells hit the Amethyst at approximately 0930 hours. They came from the northern bank, from PLA artillery batteries that had been emplaced along the river bank in preparation for the crossing, whether it was a deliberate decision taken at a high command level to attack the British vessel, or a local commander's autonomous action, or simply a catastrophic error by gunners who may not have recognized the white ensign, is a question that historians have debated ever since, and that was never definitively resolved. What is not debated is the effect. The Amethyst was hit almost immediately by multiple rounds from 75 millimeters and 105 millimeter artillery pieces firing at relatively short range. The bridge was devastated in the first few minutes. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Bernard Skinner, was fatally wounded. The first lieutenant was killed. The helmsman was killed. Within the first hour of the attack, which came without any warning, without any attempt at communication, without any opportunity for the crew to understand what was happening or why, 17 men were dead, and dozens more were wounded. The ship, struck in vital systems, began to lose power and steerage. She ran aground on a mudflat near the village of Sanqiangying, 4 miles from where the shelling began, listing slightly, exposed on all sides, and the shells kept coming. In the captain's cabin, where Simon had been sleeping in the particular luxurious contentment of a well-fed ship's cat on a warm morning, a shell burst through the hull. The explosion in that confined space was catastrophic. The wooden furnishings splintered into shrapnel. Metal fragments filled the air. Fires started instantly. And Simon, who had been curled in dreamless sleep, perhaps 3 feet from the point of impact, was caught in the full force of the blast. He should have died in that cabin. Every piece of physics and biology pointed to that conclusion. The concussive force of a shell exploding in an enclosed space is enough to rupture eardrums, burst blood vessels, collapse lungs. The metal fragments that radiated outward from the explosion were moving at velocities that would have passed through the cat's small body without resistance. The fire that erupted afterward would have finished whatever the initial blast left undone. That Simon survived the first minutes after that explosion is not something that can be fully explained by logic or science. It can only be described as fact. He was alive when they found him, hours later, and his survival would go on to have consequences that extended far beyond the life of one small cat. The medical officer who examined Simon in the ship's sickbay, HMS Amethyst's surgeon, working in conditions of extreme stress, with human casualties filling every available space, made a careful inventory of the injuries. Severe burns to the face and legs, the fur scorched away to exposed and bleeding skin. Multiple lacerations from metal fragments, at least 4 of which were embedded deeply enough to require surgical extraction. A ruptured eardrum on the left side. Extreme dehydration. Signs of smoke inhalation. The surgeon performed what surgery he could without general anesthesia. There was not enough to spare, and did it with the clinical speed of a man who had 18 human patients waiting outside and was acutely aware that time was both precious and potentially running out. He removed the visible fragments with forceps. He cleaned the burns with saline. He dressed the wounds with what bandages were available. And then he said, or something to this effect, that Simon probably would not survive the night. That was the honest medical assessment. Simon had other ideas. By the following morning, Simon was alive, not thriving, not walking, not in any sense of the word well, but alive, which was more than the medical officer had dared to predict. And by the morning after that, he was attempting to move. And by the end of the first week, a week during which the PLA artillery had continued to pound the stranded Amethyst at intervals, during which the Royal Navy had attempted 3 separate rescue operations that were beaten back with additional casualties, during which the ship's situation had gone from desperate to something that might be described as sustainable desperation. Simon had resumed something very close to his normal routine. He was patrolling the ship, slowly, obviously in pain, with a gait that had been permanently altered by his injuries and would never fully return to the fluid, predatory ease of a healthy young cat, but he was moving, through the corridors and the mess decks and the engine room, appearing in places where sailors worked and ate and tried to sleep, sitting with a deliberate, almost formal quality of presence that seemed to say, I am here, I am still here, and you should be too. It is impossible to be certain what Simon understood about his own situation, or about the situation of the ship and its crew. Cats are not humans. They do not process the abstractions of geopolitics or military strategy, or the particular shame and fury of a naval vessel caught in a humiliating trap by an enemy it was not supposed to be at war with. But cats are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of the people around them, and the emotional state of HMS Amethyst's surviving crew in those first days of the siege was one of collective trauma that manifested in a dozen different ways. The shaking hands, the sleeplessness, the sudden silences that fell over men who had been talking, the particular 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans learned to recognize and that young sailors on their first deployment had no frame of reference for at all. They were grieving, they were frightened, they were exhausted, they had watched their friends die. They were trapped in a river, in a country that apparently wanted them dead, in a ship that was damaged and short of fuel and food, with no clear timeline for rescue, and no certainty that rescue was even coming. And into all of that, with his scorched fur and his halting walk, and his incongruous habit of settling himself on someone's lap or chest with a rumbling purr, came Simon. He went to the wounded first, in the sick bay, where the most serious casualties lay in their bunks. He would jump up, carefully, with less spring than before, but purposefully, and settle himself beside a man, or on a man's legs, if the man's torso was bandaged, and simply stay there. The ship's surgeon, in a report he filed after the crisis ended, wrote that Simon's visits to the sick bay had a measurable effect on the psychological state of the wounded men. They talked to the cat. They stroked him. They laughed sometimes at the absurdity of the situation. Here they were, in the middle of a shooting war, being comforted by an injured cat, and laughter, even brief and exhausted laughter, was doing something that morphine could not do. It was reminding them that they were still human, that the world still contained things worth smiling at, that they were not, quite yet, lost. Have you ever read a story like this one and wondered what it truly costs to survive? Leave a comment below, because what Simon did next will change the way you think about courage forever. The new commanding officer of HMS Amethyst, after the deaths of the captain and first lieutenant in the initial attack, was Lieutenant Commander John Kierans. Kierans had not been aboard when the shelling started. He was ashore on duty in Nanking and had to make a hair-raising journey by small boat to reach his new command in the middle of the ongoing crisis. He arrived to find a ship that was battered, understaffed, running low on supplies, and led at the moment by the most senior surviving officer, a man who was doing everything right but was visibly at the edge of his endurance. Kieran's was, by every account, an exceptional officer. He was calm in a way that was not performed calmness, but seemed to come from a genuine, deep-seated capacity for equanimity in the face of circumstances that would have broken most men. He assessed the situation with what can only be described as professional clarity. The ship was grounded, she was under observation and intermittent fire. She lacked the fuel and the political authorization to simply blast her way out. And the negotiations that the British government was conducting with the PLA through intermediaries were proceeding with glacial slowness and no obvious endpoint. He had to hold his command together for however long it took. He had to keep the men functional, keep their discipline intact, keep them from the various forms of psychological collapse that prolonged siege situations tend to produce. And in this project, unexpectedly, but perhaps inevitably, Simon became his most important ally. Kieran's recognized immediately what Simon was doing for the crew. He saw it in the way men's faces changed when the cat appeared in a compartment. A subtle relaxation, a return of something that might be called ease, as if Simon's presence recalibrated the atmosphere of a space from pure tension to something more bearable. He saw it in the sick bay, where the wounded men tracked Simon's movements with the focused attention of people who had decided, consciously or not, that the cat's survival was in some sense a sign about their own. He heard it in the conversations, sailors talking to the cat, sailors talking about the cat, arguing in the exhausted, semi-playful way of men who have been cooped up too long, about whether Simon had preference for one mess deck over another, whether he had been spending more time with the engineering crew than the gunners, whether he was eating more or less than usual, what this might mean. These were not important conversations. That was exactly the point. They were normal conversations. They were the kind of conversations that happened on ships at sea in peacetime, the trivial banter that keeps human beings from disappearing entirely into the machinery of military routine. And their presence in the middle of a siege meant that the siege had not entirely consumed everything. Kieran's did not romanticize this. He was a naval officer, not a sentimentalist, and he understood precisely what was happening in terms that did not require any appeal to the mystical or the poetic. Simon was a morale asset. In the calculus of keeping a crew operational under extreme stress, Simon was performing a function that was as real and as measurable as any piece of equipment at home, the ship. So Kieran's supported him. He ensured that Simon received his rations, a non-trivial consideration on a vessel that was beginning to run short of food. And he allowed the informal rituals that had grown up around the cat to continue and even to elaborate themselves. He did not discourage the nickname the sailors had given to the particularly large and aggressive rat that Simon seemed to be engaged in a personal vendetta against, Mao Zedong. He understood the psychology of that naming. He understood what it meant for men who were not permitted to express anger at the force that was actually trapping them to displace that anger onto a rat, and to watch their ship's cat go to war against it with a focused ferocity that seemed almost personal. It was, in its way, a form of therapy that no military psychologist in 1949 would have been equipped to prescribe. But that worked. The rats were, it should be said, not a trivial problem. They had always been present on the Amethyst, as they are present on any vessel. Simon's primary function before the siege had been exactly this, keeping their population suppressed enough that they did not threaten the food stores or the ship's wiring. But the siege conditions changed the calculus. The ship was stationary. Its stores of rice and dried provisions, which were finite and non-replenishable, were now under sustained attack from a rat population that had no natural check besides Simon. And Simon, injured as he was fighting at a significant disadvantage. He could not move with his previous speed. He could not jump and land with his previous precision. He was an apex predator, operating at perhaps 60% of his normal capacity, against a prey population that had grown larger and bolder during the weeks when he had been incapacitated. The ship's surgeon noted in his records that Simon killed at least 50 rats during the siege, a figure that becomes more remarkable when you account for his injuries, and more remarkable still when you consider what 50 additional rats in the food stores would have meant for a crew already consuming reduced rations. This was not a metaphorical contribution. This was not a symbolic gesture. Simon was quite literally preventing the biological attrition of the crew through a combination of stubborn physical effort and predatory skill that refused to be diminished by what should have been disabling wounds. The man the sailors had named after Mao Zedong, the great rat, the dominant male who seemed to understand that the ship's defender was weakened and who had become almost insolently bold in his raids on the stores, was reportedly the last to fall. Simon hunted him for days, tracking him through the bilges and the storage compartments with a patience and a focused intensity that several crew members witnessed and described afterward. The exact circumstances of the encounter were not recorded in any official document, but the outcome was not in doubt. Simon brought the rat to the mess deck with the air of an animal who has settled a personal score, and the sailors who saw it laughed with a genuine, uncomplicated delight. That was the first real laughter many of them had produced in weeks. Think about that. Think about what laughter meant in that context. They were 100 men, fewer now, than had boarded the ship, trapped in a river, in a country that didn't want them, under the guns of an army that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill them, with dwindling supplies and no clear rescue date, and the particular psychological weight of knowing that the rest of the world was mostly watching from a safe distance. Laughter was not nothing. Laughter was, in the strict clinical sense, a neurological event that temporarily interrupted the fight-or-flight cascade that prolonged stress produces, that reduced cortisol levels, that allowed the muscles of the face and chest and diaphragm to do something other than prepare for impact. Simon made them laugh, in the way that only animals can, without drama, without the self-consciousness that human beings bring to every act of comfort. He made them laugh. And on the days when there was nothing to laugh about, and there were many such days, he did something quieter and perhaps more valuable. He was simply present. He moved through the ship like something that the siege had not touched, like a principle of continuity that existed outside the reach of artillery and politics and the slow, grinding calculation of two nations deciding what a British frigate's freedom was worth. He sat with men who were afraid. He slept in the laps of men who could not sleep. He appeared at moments of peak tension before artillery rounds began falling again, in places where his appearance had no explanation other than something like instinct. A sense, perhaps, that someone needed him to be there. Whether this constitutes anything like consciousness or empathy in the way those words are used about human beings is a question that philosophers and scientists have not resolved and will probably not resolve in our lifetimes. What is not a question is the effect. The effect was documented. The effect was real. The effect was, in the judgment of the officers who wrote about it afterward, significant enough to have materially influenced the outcome of the siege. Because the siege did end. It ended on the night of July 30th, 1949, after 101 days. By that point, the negotiating position between Britain and the PLA had reached a complete impasse. The Chinese communists wanted the British to sign a document that amounted to an admission of wrongdoing, an admission that HMS Amethyst had violated Chinese territorial sovereignty, which the Royal Navy and the British government were not prepared to give. The diplomatic channel had produced nothing except increasingly tense exchanges of letters, and the practical situation aboard the Amethyst was deteriorating. Fuel was at critically low levels. Food was being rationed in ways that were beginning to affect the crew's ability to function. The psychological reserves that had sustained the men through 3 months of captivity and intermittent shelling were not infinite. Cairns made the decision that would define his career. He would make a run for it. Under cover of darkness, using a passing merchant ship, a Chinese steamer, as an inadvertent screen to conceal his initial movement from the PLA artillery positions, he ordered the engines to full power and the Amethyst to move. What followed was a 100-mile dash down the Yangtze toward the open sea, through waters patrolled by PLA gunboats, past artillery batteries that had pinned the ship for more than 3 months, in the darkness, at maximum speed, with a crew that had been under siege since April, and was running on something that was beyond tiredness, beyond even the specific alertness that danger produces, something that might best be described as pure concentrated will. They were fired upon. More than once, the ship was hit again, men were wounded. And still, she ran, accelerating through the night. And somewhere in the darkness, Simon was in the ship. Where exactly, nobody seems to have recorded. Riding the acceleration and the impacts with the stolid equanimity of an animal that had already been blown up once, and had decided, apparently, that this was simply what life on a warship felt like. When the Amethyst reached the open sea and the radio crackled with Cairns's famous signal, "Have rejoined the fleet south of Wusong. No damage or casualties. God save the king." It was not entirely accurate. There had been casualties. There had been damage. But the signal was not a lie so much as a statement of intent. They had made it, they were free, and the Royal Navy does not, on the night of its escape from a 3-month siege, report its wounds before it reports its victory. The ship was met by Royal Navy vessels in the estuary, and the celebrations that erupted, on the Amethyst, in the fleet, in the British press which had followed the crisis, with a fixated attention that reflected how deeply the siege had penetrated national consciousness, were genuine and deserved. The crew of the Amethyst had done something remarkable. They had held together under fire for 101 days, and they had gotten out. Cairns received the Distinguished Service Order. Numerous crew members were decorated. And Simon? Simon received a mention in dispatches, which was a start. But it was not enough, and the men who had served on the Amethyst knew it was not enough. And they said so loudly, through the channels available to them, and through the rather more powerful channel of public opinion, which had followed Simon's story with an attachment that surprised even those who had been closest to it. The campaign for a proper recognition of Simon's service was not a sentimental campaign, or not only a sentimental campaign. It was a campaign that understood something true and important, that Simon had performed a function during the siege of the Amethyst that was indistinguishable in its practical effects from the functions performed by the men around him. He had kept the biological threat of rats at bay. He had maintained the psychological cohesion of the crew at moments when that cohesion was under serious assault. He had been wounded in the service of his ship, and he had returned to duty, and he had kept doing his job. The fact that he was a cat was a distinction that mattered enormously to the paperwork, and not at all to the 100 men who had lived through those 101 days alongside him. What does it mean to hold the line? Not in the political sense, not in the military sense, in the simplest, most human sense. What does it mean to be present, to keep moving, to refuse the easy option of stopping? Simon had no ideology. He had no concept of the British Empire or Chinese communism or the Cold War or the geopolitical significance of the Yangtze River. He had wounds, and he had the ship, and he had the people on it. And every morning for 101 days, he chose the ship and the people over the alternative, which was to find the warmest and most sheltered place aboard and stay there until the world became safe again. That is not nothing. That is, by any measure that counts, a form of courage. Share this video if you think Simon's story deserves to be remembered. The journey home should have been a triumph, And in many ways it was. The Amethyst docked at Plymouth on November 1st, 1949, to crowds that lined the harbor, and crowds that lined the streets, and the kind of press reception that only the post-war British public, still processing its own recent trauma and hungry for stories of survival and dignity, could produce in its full, exuberant form. Simon was aboard, still, listed in the ship's complement, and the photographers wanted him. The public wanted him. The newspapers had been running his story for months, since the first details of the siege had filtered out through naval channels and diplomatic dispatches. And the British public had responded to it with the particular intensity that the British reserve for animals who behave, in some sense, heroically. Simon was carried down the gangplank by a sailor, posed for photographs with an air of complete indifference to the circus around him, and was then subjected to the mandatory requirement of British port regulations, quarantine. The laws governing the import of animals into Britain in 1949 were strict, and, for Simon, particularly cruel in their timing. He was placed in quarantine at the animal facility in Hackbridge, Surrey, on November 1st, the same day that the Amethyst docked. He was housed in a comfortable facility. He was visited by crew members who traveled to see him. He was, in the clinical sense, well cared for. But he was alone. After 101 days in which he had never been without the presence of his crew, in which the sounds and smells of a naval vessel had been the entire texture of his reality, he was in a quiet room, in a quarantine facility, and the silence must have been a kind of violence. He had survived the shells. He had survived the surgery without anesthesia. He had survived the rats and the heat and the uncertainty of 101 days of siege. But the respiratory infection that developed in quarantine, a viral condition that his immune system, already weakened by his war wounds and the sustained stress of the siege, was not able to fight off, was the thing that finally stopped him. Simon died on November 28, 1949, in quarantine at Hackbridge. He was approximately 2 years old. The grief that followed his death was not performed, and was not, in any sense of the word, disproportionate. It was the grief of people who understood, at some level that was not fully articulable, but was entirely real, that what had died was not only a cat, but something larger, a particular quality of witness, a certain form of presence that had existed through the worst of the Amethyst crisis, and that nothing could replace. The Times of London published an obituary. Hundreds of letters arrived at naval headquarters from members of the public. More than 800 people attended his funeral at the PDSA Animal Cemetery at Ilford, which he reached in a small white coffin with a Union Jack draped over it, carried by a naval honor guard. He was buried with full naval honors. The headstone reads, "In memory of Simon, served in HMS Amethyst, April 1949 to November 1949. Awarded Dickin Medal. Died 28th November 1949. Throughout the Yangtze incident, his behavior was of the highest order." It is a spare inscription, as military inscriptions tend to be, but the last line carries a weight that only amplifies with time. Behavior of the highest order. Not merely for a cat, not merely for an animal mascot, for any entity, human or otherwise, that might find itself in the conditions the Amethyst endured. Behavior of the highest order. The Dickin Medal, which Simon received posthumously, is the highest military award available to animals in the United Kingdom. It was established in 1943 by Maria Dickin, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, to recognize the service of animals in wartime. It has been awarded to dogs, horses, pigeons, and, as of November 1949, once to a cat. Simon remains the only feline recipient in the medal's history. The citation that accompanied the award was written with the careful, slightly formal language of military commendation, but what it described was straightforward. Simon had continued to perform his duties under enemy fire, had maintained crew morale under conditions of prolonged siege, had contributed materially to the defense of the food supply, and had done all of this while suffering from wounds that would have been considered disabling for a human service member. He was also given a formal rank, Able Seaman, which sounds whimsical until you understand that it was the Royal Navy's way of including him in the structure of honor and recognition that it extends to its own. He was not a mascot. He was a member of the crew. The rank said so. What Simon's story leaves you with, in the end, is not primarily the military history, fascinating and consequential as that history is. What it leaves you with is a question about the nature of courage, and about whether courage is something that requires understanding to be real. The conventional view is that courage is a conscious act, that it involves the deliberate choice to face danger that you understand, for a reason that you understand, in service of a goal that you understand. By this definition, Simon was not courageous. He did not know about the PLA artillery. He did not know about the Yangtze incident, or the Cold War, or the fate of the British Empire in Asia. He did not choose to return to duty after his surgery in any meaningful sense of the word choose. He moved through the ship because the ship was his world, and the people on it were his people, and there was no other world available to him. And so he went on, the way small things do, without reflection, without rhetoric, without the self-consciousness that humans bring to their moments of decision. And yet, the effect of his going on was indistinguishable from the effect of courageous human action. The men who saw him walking his rounds, injured and slow but present, were changed by it. Their own will to continue was reinforced by his example. The ship held together in part because of him. People lived who might otherwise have died, not in the immediate, physical sense of Simon pulling someone from the water, but in the slower, more diffuse sense of a crew whose psychological cohesion did not break, because the small things of normal life had not entirely disappeared. If the outcomes are the same, if the effect on human behavior and human survival is the same, does the presence or absence of conscious intention change what we call the thing? Does it change what it is worth? These are not questions with easy answers. They are, however, questions that Simon's story forces on anyone who engages with it seriously. And that is part of why the story has lasted as long as it has. Not because it is charming, not because a cat with a medal is inherently funny or cute or good for a news cycle, but because it points at something real about what keeps people alive when everything is working against them. And because that something real turns out, on inspection, to be smaller and stranger and more fundamental than any ideology or institution has ever managed to fully contain. It is the simple, irrational, probably inexplicable conviction that you are not alone, that the world still has warmth in it, that something small and stubborn and alive is sharing the danger with you and has not left and will not leave. That is what Simon gave to the crew of HMS Amethyst. That is what his story gives to anyone who hears it. And that, perhaps, is worth more than we know how to properly say. If you've made it to the end of this story, you're the kind of person who understands that history is not made only by generals and politicians and grand strategic decisions. It is made too by the small, persistent things that refuse to stop. If that idea means something to you, if Simon's story has given you something you want to carry forward, then subscribe to this channel. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories that never made it into the textbooks. Stories that happened in the gaps between the official histories, where the real human truth of war and survival tends to live. Simon was not the only animal who served in a way that changed the outcome of a conflict. He was not the only small thing that held a large thing together by the simple force of its presence. He was, however, perhaps the most perfectly documented case. The one where the military records and the personal testimonies and the weight of independent historical analysis all converge on the same conclusion: that this mattered, that it was real, that the Amethyst and her crew would not have come home the same way, or perhaps at all, without him. Take a moment before you leave this video to think about the Simons in your own life. The small, consistent presences that do not make speeches and do not seek recognition and do not ask to be remembered, but that hold the line in the quiet ways that make the large things possible. They deserve to be noticed. They deserve to be named. And so does he. His grave is still there. The PDSA Animal Cemetery at Ilford in East London, in a quiet corner of a city that has largely forgotten what the Yangtze incident was, let alone what one small cat's presence aboard a besieged frigate contributed to its resolution. But the grave is maintained. The headstone is clean. Sailors from the Royal Navy still visit, occasionally, in ones and twos, in uniform or out of it. And they stand there for a while, the way people stand at the graves of those who served alongside them and are gone. There is no ceremony required. There is no protocol. They just stand there, in the way that Simon once stood on the decks of the Amethyst, present, quiet, holding something together by the sheer fact of being there. And then they leave, and Simon stays, as he always did, as he always will.